So let's start with Time to Act, Women Stand for Peace. Please welcome to the stage now Anne Marchant, CEO, the Walker Marchant Group, and the panelists for this session. Here they are. Thank you so much.
Bonjour. We are here at a very challenging time in the day, being right after lunch. So I hope everybody had a good lunch and are ready to tackle some important issues and talk about how women play key roles and the benefits of women involved in that. And for that conversation, I have two friends here who, when they get up in the morning and they go to work to solve world peace. So at the end of the day, when people talk about what they've done, these women are on the front lines trying to solve peace issues, trying to bring people together to find common ground, trying to make the world a better place. So thank you. To my left is Sanam, and I am going to let her tell you a little bit about her life and how she got to the place that she is and all of the success that she's had, but what prompted her to think about this as a career choice, what prompted her to think that she could make a difference, and give us some thoughts about what we can all do.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's the nap time, so I'm going to try and keep it short, and hopefully we have a conversation. My name is Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini. I'm Iranian by background. I run an organization. We spearhead a network of women who become peace builders in countries that are affected by war, violent extremism, and closed political space. I have partners who were poets in Yemen before the Yemen war broke out. I have partners who lost a child in a war and decided to walk into the jungle in Sri Lanka to find out what happened to their children and who it was that killed them, and try and seek the humanity in the other. These women inspire me extraordinarily all the time. And the reason why I got involved in this work was that I was 11 when the Iranian Revolution kind of came as a tsunami into our lives, and we got thrown out of our country. I landed in England. I was meant to be gone for 10 days on a Christmas holiday, and it ended up being 7 years before I went back to Iran. And one of the things that I realized as I grew up in England was that for the world, the Iranian Revolution was a moment in history. It was a news item that kind of flashed across people's news screens and then disappeared. But for us, it became a lifetime event, and each decade of our lives are affected by it. And so I became interested in the idea of how, number one, I didn't want anybody to go through what I did. I didn't get to see my father for 7 years. But how do you go from dictatorship to democracy without having to go through war? That's been something that I've thought about a lot and worked on. And then since the end of the Cold War, when most of the wars that we're seeing around the world are civil wars, or they're happening within the borders of a country, even if they're proxy actors, we don't have an international system that can really deal with them effectively, because the laws that we have say that the non-interference is prime, right? So we saw in Rwanda in 1994, there was a genocide. And it was on our screens. I was working in the CNN newsroom at the time, and there was Mandela in South Africa and a genocide in Rwanda. And I was like, I don't want to just observe this. I want to be part of preventing it. So I became involved in this work, and the first thing that I discovered was, of course, that there are women in all of these places, and when the crisis hits, there are women with courageous hearts who run to the problem and who try to solve the issues. And whether they do it through doing humanitarian work or trying to negotiate ceasefires or looking after their communities or looking after victims of violence or looking for people who've been disappeared, or if it's people who believe in the cause and pick up weapons and become part of the war effort. Women are all over in these places, and they were completely invisible in our international discourse, in the media, and so forth. So I ended up getting involved in getting a Security Council resolution in 2000, and so the story goes on, and my mother says that ever since I got involved, I've made the world has gotten worse, so maybe I'm not doing such a good job.
I don't think that's the case, but thank you. Yuliya is representing Ukraine, is here as a voice of people and women and mothers in Ukraine, and can give us insights. We know what we see on the news, we know what we read about, but oftentimes we don't hear the real story.
Thank you so much, and it is really honorable for me to be here and to join this lovely forum and to have a possibility in person and from the first hand to talk with you and to explain what is going on in my country around the negotiations and what the contribution of women in it. Since the first Russian soldiers stepped on our country in 2014 and temporarily occupied several of our regions, there wasn't any peaceful year in my country, in Ukraine. Especially after the full-scale invasion on February this year, the peaceful settlement is the core issue for all Ukrainians and for me as well. Today I present the team of Council of Europe in Ukraine, and we are working on internal strength of local communities in Ukraine, and it is as important this internal strength of our economy, of our public authorities, as what is going on frontline. And also, I'm a mom of 3 kids, 2 boys and 1 daughter. And also, I'm a daughter of a Ukrainian soldier. So the war is so important for me as well. But before we are going to discuss the role of women in their contribution to the peace, you need to understand the reason and the pretext of this war that Russian state started on 2014. And you shouldn't believe to all this propaganda that is spread by their media across their society and across the developed countries. And that it is like our internal conflict, that Ukrainians are just fighting against another Ukrainians, that not we, but our citizens have a possibility to vote freely in referendums, no. That there are a lot of Nazists among Ukrainians and we disrespect Russians on our country, no. And all these things that they've started in my country, in Ukraine, they have only one aim. They want to turn back the Soviet Union again. I think that they are enough economically weak that they thought that while increasing territorially, they will have more strength to influence on the whole world and to more strengthful countries. So from this point of view, I would like you to know that there are no negotiations, no official negotiation today with our enemy. And there is only one reason for that, because their demands are not acceptable for us. We are not going to lose our country, we are not going to lose our independence, and we are not going to forgive all horror that they've done with our people and with our territory. And this war is not only about the territory, it is about the people who are living in these lands. So for this reason, mostly women are contributing indirectly in the strengthening of the positions for the further negotiation. And first of all, it means that a lot of women, they are the part of military forces of Ukraine. More than 15% of military forces of Ukraine are consisted from women. Also, a lot of our women, our members of parliament, our diplomatic women are taking part in different international affairs, and you could see as well our First Lady, Olena Zelenska, and she already changed the attitude to this position. Also, there are a lot of women that are volunteering, and they are involved in the processes for gathering the extra support. The most motivated volunteers are those whose husbands or whose fathers are fighting in military forces of our country. And the last but not the least, there are a lot of civilian women in Ukraine, mothers, sisters, daughters, whose duty today is to save our future, our kids. And they decide themselves to stay and live as me in my city, because I'm living in Lviv still, and I didn't have to flee abroad. But still, there are a lot of temporary refugees of Ukrainian women, their kids. And I would like to thank your countries and thank you that you are helping them for that thing. So the main thing that I would like to say now, that the place where negotiations are holding today, it is not a round table. Nobody is sitting around the table today on official negotiations. The only body who negotiates today is military forces of Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. Sanam, you've worked all over the world, and I'm sure that you understand what Yuliya just explained. What is the perspective that women, the common perspective that you see that women bring in conflict zones, in areas of war? Is there something that you think that women are more equipped to introduce to get to solutions around peacekeeping?
I think that I think what Yuliya is saying about what's going on in Ukraine is not unique historically, because of course we've always had, in the past we used to have wars of aggression, and you know, you could argue that the Iraq War was also a war of aggression and so forth, but so one country invading another one. But what we see in all these other contexts, Syria and elsewhere, is that women the women who emerge and want to be activists in their societies, often, you know, they may start as human rights activists, they may start as teachers. They are focused on the needs of the community. And so often what happens is that if you take a Yemen context, for example, you have the government, they're bombing with the help of the Saudis. You have militias, and they're also bombing communities. And in the middle of that, it's kids that are dying, and it's civilians that are getting hurt. And people, and it's a polarized space, obviously. But what we find is that, at least the women who become peace activists suddenly say, hang on a second, this isn't working for us anymore. You know, we're just killing each other. And somebody needs to get the kids who have cancer out, and somebody needs to get food in, and somebody needs to negotiate. And by the way, when it's a civil conflict, half the time they know each other. It's peoples and families and so forth. So we often see women occupy very invisible spaces. And then when they have the opportunity to come together across the lines of conflict, as their identity as women, so it's, you know, you get polarized, say in Northern Ireland, it was polarized around Catholic and Protestant identities. But when they had a chance to come together, they realized that they actually have more in common as women than what divides them on their ethnicity or their race or their sect or whatever it is that the war is. And that becomes a really powerful force, because it becomes this human lens, and it's the lens of what about the kids, what about the elderly, what about the people who are disappeared, what about the victims of rape, and so forth. And it's, you know, you often hear, oh, this is so idealistic and women are so idealistic. No, women are really, really practical. They bring really practical solutions to the tables, and they think about the root causes, they think about the depth. They're not interested in conflict management, as we're often told. It's really like, what was the course of the problem and what's the long-term solution? And what I've seen repeatedly is that women look to the future. And so often these agreements or these processes They're looking at the past and letting the past determine the present, which then becomes shaping the future. So it's very easy to say, oh, these guys were fighting, let's bring them to the table and do a power sharing deal. And so the guys with the guns then get all the political power and all the economic power. And then we wonder why the process fails 3 years, 5 years, 10 years in. Women are saying that's not enough. We have to negotiate with the men with the guns and the groups with the guns, because obviously they have the violence in their hands. But we need to be really thinking about the root causes and the future solutions, and diluting their influence, thinking about questions of justice and impunity, thinking about reconciliation where it needs to happen, and that balancing act that needs to happen in societies. As I say, very practical, very pragmatic, very future-oriented, and very, very human. And it just changes the context of the conversations, both the atmosphere, but also the substance that's being addressed. And I'll give you just one example. I mean, in Liberia, for example, the UN went in and they wanted to do disarmament of fighters. And they put them all in one compound. And it was hot, and people didn't have food, and you're putting people who were fighting each other. The women went in and actually mediated and managed to get the guns out of the guys' hands and calm them down and talk to them. And you know, it's really practical things that go on. Their stories don't get told. They get erased out of their own history.
And that's the one-on-one contact, the one-on-one reaching each person and using that as an opportunity to try to mindset. It struck me, and it still sticks with me, Yuliya, one of the first conversations that we had, you talked about not being interested in a short-term solution. The rawness of which you spoke about 2014 and the negotiations that occurred, and only to be where you are right now and saying, I'm not looking for a short-term solution. We're not interested in going to the table. We want this to be finished, and whatever we have to do to end it.
Yes, for sure, and it will be complemented to what Sanam said, that Ukraine today is not interested in temporary solutions and temporary agreements. We've already seen it after the Minsk agreement in 2014, when we signed a peaceful agreements, and everybody was supposed to stop fighting. But Russia took this time, and they're just preparing for the next invasion. And that's why we are thinking about the future. We're thinking about our, and not women are thinking about it, but I think that women have more emotional links with their kids as well. And so that's why it is so important, firstly, emotionally for us, to reduce the risk for our kids in the future, so they were ought and obliged to go to the war and to be killed by the terrorists. And for this reason, Ukraine now is not interested in short-term agreements. And we're interested only in sustainable peace that will mean no territorial claims, that will mean that Russians should leave our land, fully land, in Crimea Peninsula and Donbass as well. And also the sustainable peace will mean that there will be no threat for our future and the future for all the democratic world around in other countries, because Russians, they've just opened the Pandora box, if you know what I mean, and all the other dictatorship countries will follow their example, and they will try to press to international organization, to NATO, to all around, every organization all around the world, and to press the smallest countries, smallest neighbors. So we just need to close that box.
Thank you. And you also talked a little bit about how integral women are in the government and the positions that they hold. So once there is a roundtable, or a peace process that begins, that women will be part of that?
Yes, sure. After the Minsk agreement in 2014, we've got a trilateral contact group that consists of two women in it. But after the full-scale invasion, this contact group is not working as well. But still, we have a lot of women that's like bees working on the consequences of the war. First of all, it depends to our Deputy Prime Minister. She's working with the war-prisoned people. And also, we've got a female Commissioner for Human Rights till the recent times. And also, we have 22% of our cabinet of ministers that are women. And that professional issue is to solve the problems and to address the needs of women, kids, and every victim of this war. So I think that women today are really visible in every process that is going on in my country, and women have enough power to bring to the agenda of communication with the enemy all the needs, not only actually the women and kids and the men as well. And I would like to tell you a little example of it. Just recently, our intelligence was able to release from captivity a female doctor, and she was pregnant, and she was in captivity for a long 6 months. And her conditions was not enough an argument for the Russians to give her a possibility to be exchanged with other soldiers. So she stayed in captivity during all her pregnancy. You know, and I have any rhetorical questions. Didn't they understand that she is pregnant and she must be exchanged? And it will turn us back to the aims of this war.
That brings up a very difficult, there are many difficult issues, but the issue of women and girls in conflict zones and how the sexual abuse, the rape, the abuse of women is used as a tool in war. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So when you have sectarian or ethnic conflict, one of the things that we've observed is that women's bodies become the battlefield. Because if you're trying to destroy the identity of a community, you force a pregnancy, you rape and you force a pregnancy. If you're living in a patriarchal society, in which most societies are, and you're trying to emasculate a man, raping his woman or his women is one way of doing that. So it's really men communicating with men through women's bodies. That's one thing. The second thing that we see is that in a number of places, so for example in the Democratic Republic of Congo and those areas, there are incredibly rich minefields. And one of the things that's happening is that the threat of rape is a way of forcing displacement. So getting the locals to leave their land, their property, their what is rich soil and so forth to, so that's another aspect of the sexual violence issues. These issues, on the one hand, are not new, right? Rape has been a weapon of war for a long time and a tactic of war. But we brought them out and started talking about them in the last 25 years publicly. And we have, again, Security Council resolutions and legislation and in the International Criminal Court statutes and so forth. And what's interesting, when those Resolution 1820 was being negotiated in 2008, we were trying to back channel at home. I had one of my kids I have twins, and one of them was really sick, so she was sort of Benadrylled up, and typing away on my laptop to members of the Security Council to say, please include references to men and boys as victims of sexual violence as well. And at the time, Libya was on the Security Council, and they kept deleting the reference to men and boys, saying this doesn't happen. So we had to put gender-neutral language. We had to say people, civilians, as a way of being inclusive of men and boys. And one of the things that occurred afterwards was that we had some criticism from people who were doing human security saying, oh, this is just about women talking, this is about women's organizations wanting to get money for women. Why aren't they talking about men and boys? And I said, first, we tried. We couldn't. Secondly, for 3,000 years, this has been happening. You guys have been in charge. You could have raised the issue of sexual violence and what happens to civilians and the human dimension and so forth, and you didn't. Women had the courage to come forward and bring the real truth and the real horrors and the complexity of war. And as we open the door, everybody else rushes in. So now people talk about young people and what happens to them. They're talking about widows. We're talking about people with disabilities and so forth. So through the lens of women, you get the heterogeneity and the complexity of society and what is happening. And that's the human face of war that needs to be brought. But it's also the human face of peace, which I think is really important. Because we all hear about the wars and it's the violence. Underneath that layer of conflict and the news headlines, people are living their lives. And one of the most important forms of resistance is maintaining normalcy. Getting your kids to go to school, getting married, falling in love, playing music. All of that is such an important part of the spirit of keeping a society going. And again, that sits very much in the hands of women, and it's completely undervalued and taken for granted.
It sounds like there are many roles that women play, and that there are many reasons why people want women at the table, but there are equally as many reasons that we are excluded from the table. So the fight continues. I just want to acknowledge the media and the role of women in the media in telling the stories. And I've been coming to the Women's Forum for maybe 15 years, and through these years, I have met women who have lost limbs, who have lost many, many things, who have been intentionally targeted by the opposition because they were telling the stories. And they haven't stopped telling the stories. They came, they were injured badly, they were disabled, but they were not silenced. And that's with American journalists, that's with journalists from around the world, that there has been a desire to have women there telling the story. Unfortunately, we lost a journalist, a Palestinian journalist just recently, who was also on the front lines. We have a journalist who was in Ukraine who's here with us today. But what is the role of women making sure that what's happening in conflict zones is not hidden and that there's a light shown?
So, just to your point, the young journalist, female journalist who broke the Mahsa Amini story in Iran was arrested as well. So it's very risky to bring out the stories and tell the truth. For me, the question of the media is that it would be really, I think it's very important that the media tells the story of the activists and people's, the people who are running to sort out the problem, the people who are risking their own lives, people like my partners, who are incredibly inspirational figures. They're incredibly courageous figures. They have solutions, and they bring a different perspective. So bringing their voices into the mainstream media, I think, is important, because after a while you get war fatigue. It's bombs, and it's whether it's this country or that country. People want the human side, and if we bring that and we show that there is still something positive going on, it makes a tremendous difference. And I'll bring it to the case of Afghanistan. Number one, who thinks that if Afghan women had been present in Doha in the negotiations all those years, we would end up with the Taliban? Hands up if you think that, that would have still happened, right? They were kept out very, very deliberately. They were warning about the Taliban for years and years and years. And our media didn't tell the stories. It was kind of like, oh, Afghan women, it's kind of a sideshow. It was only afterwards that they realized. And if consistently in the last 20 years, we told the stories of the lawyers and the judges and the journalists who are risking their lives and the peace activists, and it would have been a very different framing of what's happening in Afghanistan, not to keep the military there, but to have negotiations where Afghan women and minorities and others were at the table as equal voices. and not have the Taliban dominate the discourse. That's kind of the story that's there. People are there. Don't ignore them. Don't erase them, because they are ahead of the news. They're not behind the headlines. They're actually ahead of the headlines.
And I want to call out Yuliya, because the courage that she's exhibiting to be here, to leave Ukraine and come and sit on this stage and tell us what's happening in Ukraine and tell us the truth about what's at risk, what's happening, and what you want to see going forward. Takes a lot of courage, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
We have no minutes left, but I'm determined, and someone's going to kill me, but I would love to take a couple of questions if anybody has a question for one of our esteemed panelists. And I think there's somebody with the microphone. One of my friends there who has also been with the Women's Forum at almost every one that I've been at.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Sheila Smirtnik, and I'm from the Conseil de Commerce Extérieur this afternoon. I would like to ask Sanam if she could maybe say a few words about the movement in Iran.
Thank you. The movement in Iran, the Women, Life, and Freedom movement, it's not the first women-led revolution in the world. Sudanese women were out, Yemeni women were out, but it is the first feminist revolution. It's the first time in the history of all of us that the call for women, life, freedom, gender equality, women's rights has become the clarion call to unite people across the ethnic, sect, class, and gender divisions. It's the first time that we're seeing men standing together with women and respecting women. That is an extraordinary moment, I think, in the history of, as I say, in the history of women's movements, but also in the history of democracy and the fight for justice and equality and rights and peace. It's a nonviolent movement that's going on right now. It is being met with significant levels of violence that we've always known and seen that the state has had. It's ebbed and flowed in the last 40 years. But so just to acknowledge that this is young women, young men, children and kids that are my kids' age on the streets fighting for their lives. They know the future they don't want. They know what that regime means and the lives that they would have if the system continues. So they're fighting for something different. The scary part, the really hard part, is that when you're a nonviolent, leaderless movement fighting for these things, and you're fighting a system that is willing to kill, the price is very, very high. And so it's an ongoing and growing event. The government is attacking minorities, the Kurdish areas and the Baluch areas. That's the majority of people who've been killed. We really need international attention. We need the UN system to have teeth, not just at the Human Rights Council and investigations and so forth, but every single UN agency, UNICEF, there are children being killed. What is UNICEF doing about it? Not just a statement. It's taken 2 months to get a statement from UNICEF. They've just charged a rapper, a singer, with crimes that could have a death penalty. Where is UNESCO? Where is UNDP? Where is the International Court of Justice? Where are all systems? So these are things that we need the world to be collectively there, and not just the Western world. We need the entirety of the world. And to the extent that I can say, I wish that we have as many eyes on the ground and watching what's happening and maintaining the focus to say, we're watching, because bad things happen in the dark. What I worry about is I don't want Iran to turn into North Korea or Venezuela and get forgotten. So it's an ongoing process, and it is, we go through roller coasters of emotion every day and every night with the news that comes out.
I think we're being signaled to leave, but
Oh, we never want you to
I know
leave.
we could
love you
talk
to
all
stay
afternoon.
all afternoon. I'm so sorry.
But can I just ask our guests to just tell us what's the one thing that we can do to be helpful?
I think that my recommendation will be like this: not to be afraid, not to be scareful, and when something goes wrong, do not be ashamed to fight for the freedom, to fight for the dignity, and to fight for your rights.
Sanam?
If any of you are in the business of solar panels, clean water, healthcare, food production that can be done in places like Cameroon and Yemen and so forth, please come talk to me, because what we have seen is that the world is not paying attention to people on the ground, and they're having to do this on their own. So there's a very practical way of helping us and this army of women. I don't like the word army, but the army of women that are really doing the work on the ground to help their communities. And the second thing is hold your own governments accountable. Whether it's France, the UK, the US, we have 10 Security Council resolutions. All of your countries have national action plans that say women should be at peace tables we support. We should do gender-responsive humanitarian work. It's all there. We've 22 years, I could paper the walls of every building with the amount of rhetoric and legal policy jargon that we have. But until governments are held accountable and our diplomats are held accountable, they will continue to maintain these exclusive spaces and make it about themselves as opposed to about the people that are on the ground doing the work.
Thank you very much. I am honored to have shared the stage with both of you, and thank you for sharing your stories, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.